I work at a cemetery on the edge of my town. It's a small one, being only a few acres of land. I'd been working there for a year at the time, and I hated every minute of it, not really because it was a cemetery, but just because it was boring. I was alone all night and sat in a small room for most of the time. There were 2 cameras set up on either side of the yard and one on the entrance of the tiny building I was in. My boss always told me that my job was to just be there, and if anything actually happened, to call the police and let them take care of it. In the whole year before this, not a single thing happened. Again, it was a small cemetery in a small town, so not a lot of action was expected. On a Monday evening, I pulled into the parking lot and relieved my coworker from his day shift. I hadn't slept well that day, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me up. For the first hour, I was sipping on my coffee and watching the cameras while also scrolling through my phone a bit. Come 1 a.m., I started to get really drowsy. I was nodding off in my chair, and the coffee wasn't really helping either. In the middle of the hour, I guess I fully fell asleep, and what I think was 20 or so minutes later, I woke up to an odd sound, metal creaking behind me. I swiveled around in my chair. The door to my building was cracked open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. My heart hurt from the strike of fear it gave me. I got up and pulled the door further open, peeking my head outside and looking around. Nobody was in sight. I slammed the door firmly shut and made sure it was fully locked. It could have been a simple mistake, not fully closing the door, but it got my hair standing up. I rolled back the footage outside the building and didn't see anyone coming up to the building. At least after this, I was wide awake. I was constantly checking each camera. About 10 minutes later, I saw something move on the screen. It was the camera on the far end of the yard. Someone was walking through the cemetery. I watched as they slowly made their way past several gravestones, then stopped. I waited a few seconds before picking up the phone and dialing 911, still keeping my eyes on the screen. I spoke softly into the phone, telling the operator that I worked at the cemetery and there was a man trespassing. The woman on the phone started responding when suddenly the man sprinted through the yard and off the screen. I let out an uncontrollable gasp, moving my eyes all around the other cameras looking for him. A second later, he appeared on the other screen, sprinting past it again, and not long after, he appeared on the screen showing the outside of the building I was in. I told the woman what was going on and that I needed to be quiet. I put the phone down and stared at the camera. It was a man who was now standing right outside the door. He then looked around at the face of the building before locking his eyes on the camera. It made me shiver, seeing him stare at the camera as if he could see me through the screen. "Hello? Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice from the other side of the door. Then, without even waiting for an answer, he walked around to the back of the building. There were no cameras on that side, but I could hear his footsteps in the grass. He sounded like he was walking right up against the wall. Then, out of nowhere, I heard his footsteps departing quickly. My heart was racing all the way up until the police came. I thought I'd sound crazy, but they found very defined shoe prints in the grass. They followed them far off, way past the cemetery border, but lost the trail before it led anywhere else. The man's behavior was very odd, and the way he asked for help was even more odd. I don't know if the door being opened earlier was somehow him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Despite being scared, I continued working and still work there. Nothing else has happened and the man never returned, but I don't think I'll ever fall asleep at the cemetery again. I was dating this chick who was a little unstable, to say the least. She'd probably kill me if she heard what I was about to say using her real name. So for my own sake, I'm going to refer to her as Jane. To make a long backstory short, she came from a messed up family, and her dad was at the center of a lot of her problems. When he finally died, she told me she went to the funeral just to find out where he was buried. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Jane called to ask me to take her to the cemetery to smash his gravestone. Although that was something I would never do to anyone, no matter how much I hated them, I could understand why Jane would want to do something like that against her father's memory. She didn't have a license, so I picked her up and we drove to the cemetery. When I parked the car in the visitor lot outside, she pulled a hammer and a handful of grocery bags out of her purse. She said she just wanted to go in. smash it into a bunch of small pieces, bag it up, and leave. Obviously, I knew we were breaking at least one law by trespassing into the cemetery after dark, but this was all right with me, and I just told her I would keep an eye out for anyone in the area while she did what she needed to do. On that note, we got out and hurried over to the grave. Jane knew exactly where it was, so it took us no time at all, but I was still extremely nervous about the whole thing. It wasn't just the threat of being arrested, but the vibe of the cemetery itself. I really felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like we were disturbing all those dead people by marching through in the middle of the night. I kept my hat on straight and tried to give Jane space. At first, she spent a minute kneeling on top of the relatively fresh grave, whispering a bunch of curses and crying from the sheer intensity of whatever emotion she was feeling. But then, without warning, she started screaming. She struck the headstone for the first time. It caught me so off guard that it sent chills through my whole body. I spun around and was about to tell her to quiet down, but at first glance I knew she wasn't going to hear me. She was going absolutely berserk on this stone, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs. Each time she hit it with the hammer, only a small piece would break off. I realized we were going to be there for a while if it went on at this pace, and she was making so much god-awful noise that I was terrified someone in the nearby neighborhood would hear us. I also thought about how blood-curdling it would feel to be walking by the graveyard and hear Jane's banshee-like shrieking in the distance and be unsure if she was a ghost or a serial killer or something. My instincts set in, and I became more concerned about my own safety than anything else. Here was this completely unhinged, crazy person, violently thrashing their way through a mixture of grief and unhealed trauma, seeing red with total tunnel vision, and I was alone with her, surrounded by darkness and dead people. I was worried that if I got near her, she would forget it was me and think I was the ghost of her father and start trying to kill me or something. So I backed away. However, it wasn't long before the deep-seated rage within Jane started to wear off a bit, and she became tired. She then stopped and looked at the progress she made. 2/3 of the headstone was still intact, but she was already exhausted. That's when she looked back at me, and for the first time I saw the look of unveiled insanity in Jane's eyes. I'd always known Jane had a few screws loose, but this was next-level crazy. All her movements were sudden and jarring. She stood and shoved the hammer into my chest, telling me to take it and finish the job. I protested at first, not wanting to get roped further into what I thought was Jane's thing she needed to do. But as soon as I did, she grabbed me by the ears and yanked my head down so that my face was less than an inch away from hers. She then screamed so loud that it practically ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I break the gravestone for her, or she'd use the hammer on me and bury my body next to her father's. Seeing that I was in too deep to back out, I reluctantly accepted the task and committed myself to making short work of it. Of course, I was stronger than Jane, but I wasn't nearly as uninhibited. What happened next, though, made me all the more sure that I shouldn't have tried to fight her or anything. As I was hacking away at the stone, managing to break off bigger pieces, she was standing behind me laughing like an absolute maniac. She was cheering me on the way I imagine a witch would encourage another witch to their first human sacrifice. I tried my best to ignore her, but it was impossible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she had pulled out a knife, which sent another chill down my spine. Before I knew it, she knelt behind me and straddled my back, throwing her arms over my shoulders, whispering pure evil into my ears. I froze up and stopped swinging the hammer because I didn't want to hit her. She told me I was almost done, then she did something I'll never forget. Both of her hands were out in front of me, one of which held the knife. Right before my eyes, she put the blade to her palm and sliced it open, creating a fountain of blood which quickly spilled down her wrist. Then she whispered some kind of satanic blessing in tongues and smeared her bloody hand over my face, from my forehead down to my chin, then across my throat until she finally rested her hand with a vice grip at the base of my neck. She asked me if I could taste the blood, and I said I could. She took pleasure in this, and then finally let go of me to stand on the grave again. Then she screamed at the top of her lungs that these would be the final tears she would ever cry over her father. As she looked up into the night sky with her eyes open, she put her hand up to the moon and clenched her fist, squeezing the wound to form drops of blood that fell down upon her eyes and face. I watched this whole thing stunned out of my mind until she looked back at me with her face full of bloody tears and growled at me to finish the job. Of course, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane by this point and was ready to leave. I just did as she said. At last, when the whole thing was smashed to bits, I convinced Jane that we needed to go. Thankfully, she seemed ready. But the entire time we were picking up the pieces and bagging them, she was giggling. When it was all cleaned up, we ran back to my car, somehow going through this whole ordeal without anyone seeing or calling the cops on us. I drove Jane back home and dropped her off. As she got out of my car, she tried to drag me out to spend the night with her. I'd been waiting for that night for months, but by then I knew where that would go. I knew it would be no good for me, so I made up some excuse about having to work the next day. In the morning, I cut off all contact and have been avoiding her out of fear ever since. My name is Jeremy. This was in the dead of October, chilly and windy. I live in a somewhat big town. It's very poor and old, with early 18th century type buildings. A friend and I were bored one night and decided to go mess around at 3 a.m. I know that going out at 3 a.m. in a poor town isn't exactly smart, but we like to have our fun. We got bored of driving around blasting our music. We're both very big metalheads, and at that point, we had our own band, so we decided it would be interesting and cool to walk around a cemetery in the town. Behind the Old Town Square, there's a massive cemetery. It's divided by two sides of a highway, both sides taking up about 20 acres of land. As I said, it's massive. We decided to check out the older part of the cemetery. This part is completely separated from the rest of the newer cemetery with an old iron fence and gate. We get to walking around and checking out the cemetery, trying to read the old moss-covered graves, taking pictures, being a little bit disrespectful. I know, but these were graves from at least a century ago, so there was no one living that would be upset by it, and I'm sure the people in the graves didn't mind too much. After about an hour of checking it out, we sit down in the middle of the old cemetery. That's when we hear this little girl laughing. I mean, it was really close to us. At first I assumed maybe it was a toy left on a child's grave or something like that. I'm not one to scare easily, so I just figured it's motion activated or something like that. We are not at all easy to scare, so we both sort of laugh, pointing out that it's creepy and just keep talking and enjoying the ambiance. Then, as in all stories like this, I get the feeling of something or someone watching me. Once again, I just figured that I was letting the entire thing get into my head. Then my friend says he thinks he sees someone in the shadows of a small wooded area right next to the cemetery, of which we were really close. At this point, we're both a little creeped out and decide to get up and leave. And that noise, the exact same noise, played again. Then we hear leaves crunching underneath the feet of someone. That's when we booked it. We ran down the hill leading to the old part of the cemetery, down to where my car was parked. I've never run that fast in my life. It sounded like that laughing noise was following us at that point. We both sort of just went into full fight or flight mode, going as fast as we could without thinking. The noises behind us stopped as we got to my car. I started my car and put it in drive, pulling out into the highway without looking. Luckily, no one hit us. We get down the road to the only gas station that's open at this time of night to check the back of my car. We had both been discussing how we were scared some stuff had been done to it. We get around to check and immediately find the back doors open. I know for a fact neither of us ever opened it. There was no reason for us to open it. I look in the back seats to make sure nothing's there, get right back in the car, and peel out. I'm still confused about what happened that night. I'm not sure if we both overreacted or what. All I know is that I still feel that weird feeling that something is behind you whenever I tell this story.